Yes, so welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to hear about our climate change strategy. I'm Sophie Barrett, the Sustainability Coordinator at Cairns Regional Council. And I'd like to also introduce Daniel Stronggrove, our Strategy and Energy Management Advisor, and Will McDonald, our Sustainability Officer. We'll be talking to you today about the climate change strategy and hopefully answering some of your questions at the end. So the format of today is that we're going to present to you about the strategy, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answer at the end. So please write your questions into the chat, and we'll make sure that we answer those at the end. We're also recording this, so if you do have any issues with this, please put it in the chat. It's just for people who are unable to make it. So I'll just start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this country, including the Jabberkai, Yirrakanji, Bullawai, Gimoy, Wallabarri, Yidinji, the Mandingalbay Yidinji, the Gunganji, the Dullabed and Malambari Yidinji, Wanyamaje, Mamu and the Nagajoni people. I think I pronounced that one wrong, but all other First people who live in this region as well. We have worked quite closely with the traditional custodians in the region in the development of this and other climate-related strategies, and are very keen to be working with traditional custodians on the implementation. We're also currently preparing a Caring for Country section of the strategy, which is not in this version, but we'll be going out and we're getting feedback from those groups and getting some quotes from them about where they see Cairns in terms of climate action by 2030. So the strategy is available on our climate change page on the Cairns Regional Council website. It's basically broken up into some front material, which is about the purpose and vision, outlines our commitments, talks a bit about our emissions reduction, and then outlines a number of actions across a number of industry focus areas. So we'll be taking you through this now to give you a bit of an idea of the content. So in terms of the vision of the strategy, Council is intending to be leaders in mitigating and adapting to the impacts of climate change. And the main 4 areas that we're focusing on are supporting a smart green economy, prioritising a healthy natural environment, building resilient, informed, low emissions communities, and also embedding climate change considerations throughout our organisation and operations. So we have 4 big commitments as part of this strategy, and these underpin all of the actions in the strategy. So number 1 is a net zero emissions for council operations by 2030. So this is an ambitious target for council and builds on our previous work, which Daniel will talk to you about in a moment. We also have another commitment for council electricity to be supplied from 100% renewable energy sources. The third one is to prepare council and the community to adapt and prosper in a changing climate, and also to support the community progress towards the state emission targets. So I'll now hand over to Daniel, who talked to you a bit about the our emissions journey.
Hey, thanks, Sophie. So obviously this is quite small. If you have this open on the web browser in front of you, you can choose to zoom in to see more detail in these segments that may be of interest to you. The council in 2010 set a goal to achieve reduce its emissions by 50% by 2020. So if you have a look at the graph in the middle of the page there. Oh yeah, there it is. Great, thanks. Thanks. Have a look at this graph here. You can see how council has tracked in its progress from its 2008 to 2007 and 08 baseline year towards that target. You can see we've actually kind of haven't quite reached it, but we've been very close for the last, or since 2014-15. The challenge we've faced is that while we have been taking efforts to improve energy efficiency and reduce fugitive emissions, we've also been building new big facilities such as CPAC and new materials recovery facility and upgrading art galleries and all sorts of improvements in terms of facilities, but they're all energy intensive improvements. We also, in 2010, opened the new wastewater treatment plants, the cleaner seas treatment plants that process all the sewage that's in Cairns, and they have much improved quality of outflow water, which is great in terms of reducing the impacts on the reef because of the discharged water. But it also came at a cost of much more energy intensive processes that are used there. So that also increased the energy consumption considerably. So the main things that have been done were the capping and flaring of the landfill at Portsmouth to reduce the methane from that landfill. There was the wastewater treatment plant upgrades I mentioned, and then we've been doing lots of work in terms of energy efficiency and installing behind the meter solar on a lot of facilities. We've now installed around 3 megawatts of solar, which has reduced our energy consumption, reduced our emissions, and it's also saved a lot of money. So all of those solar systems have been installed, and they're sort of really financially rewarding as well, which is good. So just on one thing, yes, this is a good slide to come to. One thing I'd like to point out is that in the past, we've just considered the emissions associated with our operations. So that's, for those of you familiar with this sort of terminology around emissions, sort of monitoring and management, we've been looking at our Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which are the emissions from the fuels we burn for our fleet and backup generators, things like that, and the emissions from the Scope 2 emissions from our electricity consumption. So electricity, obviously, we're buying it from Ergon, but then they're burning the coal on our behalf. So moving forwards, you'll have seen that number one commitment was that council was going to aiming to be carbon neutral by 2030. When we talk about that, what we're talking about is looking at our Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. So the Scope 3 emissions are the emissions associated with all our contracts, all those suppliers that provide services on our behalf, but for which we don't have direct control. It also includes things such as the leased facilities that council doesn't necessarily directly manage, but we own the buildings. So this sort of new target is actually far more difficult than the original target we set, and it means we're going to have to work with all of our suppliers in understanding the emissions associated with delivering us services such as the waste management processes, all the contractors providing concrete pipes and bitumen and all those sorts of materials. So we've started those conversations with our largest suppliers, and I think there's a general agreement that it's an important step that we take for the planet as a whole and for our region, and there's a willingness to take this path. What we found, the work that we did as part of the strategy was to understand what the scale of those Scope 3 emissions were, because we hadn't ever tracked them before. And the initial estimates we have suggest that they're far more significant than the emissions from the direct operations that we manage ourselves. So we're talking about the direct operations we've accounted for in the past only been about 20% of our total emissions associated with delivering all of our services to the community. So if you have a look, we've got the sort of some key actions that we understand that we can take on this pathway to net zero. I won't go through all of them in detail, but the general approach is that we're going to do all that we can to reduce our emissions through things like purchasing 100% renewable energy, renewable electricity. We'll look to electrify our fleet, electrify any other fuel-consuming equipment, and we'll obviously continue to look at improve efficiency within our operations. Once we've done what we can to reduce our emissions, we'll then look at options for offsetting. That's sort of the last sort of step we take. And we're looking to offset through projects that deliver a whole range of benefits for the region, not just reducing emissions, but also things like improving, have environmental or social co-benefits. We'll talk more about that when we look at the action section in the NRM, the natural environment focus area. So the other thing that we've taken a look at is to understand, we know in detail what our council emissions are, but council emissions really are only about 1% of the emissions within our entire community of this local government area. So we've this is a estimate of the emissions for the Cairns local government area, which is provided to us by Ironbark Sustainability, which is a specialist consultancy that do this sort of work for a lot of councils around Australia. And so we have an estimate there of what is the total emissions within our area and what are the sources of emissions. And you can see there that electricity and transport are the largest sectors. So as the electricity grid in Queensland becomes more and more sourced from renewable energy, of course, those electricity emissions will reduce. And as we see the fleets in Queensland and vehicles in general in Queensland becoming electrified, then that will also see a reduction in those transport emissions. Right, so I'll talk to this, shall I? Yep.
Yeah.
So great. So in preparing this strategy, we wanted to sort of identify actions that we could take in different sort of focus areas within the sort of, I guess, the human habitat that is Cairns. So we've focused on community and community actions, industry, looking at how we run businesses in Cairns. We're looking at the energy supply chain, we're looking at transport, built environment and natural environment. So we've teased out the specific actions within each of those 6 focus areas that we believe council has either a means to take some direct action to have some sort of influence, or that we can influence through things like advocacy. Okay. Excuse me just a moment, I'm just going to pull up my community page so I can see it in more detail. So, oh, there we go. Thanks. That's good, Sophie. So with all of the actions, we're recognising there's 2 sort of key areas we need to focus. One is mitigation and one is adaptation. So in the community sector, we've identified objectives and actions that are focusing on how we can assist the community at large to transition to a low emissions community. And we're also looking at what needs to be done to improve the resiliency of the local Cairns community. It needs to be acknowledged that in terms of transitioning the community to a low or net zero emissions community, council has a limited ability to influence that, because it's really decisions made at state or federal level that have the biggest impact on where the electricity that supplies the entire community comes from, or dictates the types of housing that should be built. But so if you read through those actions, you'll see the actions that we've identified where council can play a meaningful role. So as far as that net zero emissions is concerned, one thing we as you've seen, we're trying to quantify what the emissions are of our community through an emissions inventory, and that provides us with some direction as to what are the sort of big ticket items that we should focus on in terms of trying to assist the community to reduce its emissions. We're also looking at grants, events and programs that council can support to help the community to transition to net zero. So for example, there is a Net Zero Cairns community group that council has funded through our sustainability grants program, and they're going to be very active in the community in the near future. Also, council organise events such as Eco Fiesta, which is an opportunity to bring the community together, to share information, knowledge, inspiration, to assist the community to make changes in day-to-day lives. And also, we have in the past done community engagement programs to sort of help educate, and that's something that we will continue to do. And in terms of resiliency, council was very active in the disaster management space. Also, well, Sophie in particular has been very involved recently in the coastal hazards adaptation, developing the coastal hazards adaptation strategy, which is, I think, Sophie, you'll talk more about that in the built environment section as well. But obviously that understanding what are the risks to coastal communities from the impacts of climate change and coastal hazards is important to help the resiliency of those communities. We're also considering things such as food security. What will be the potential impacts through, on the one hand, we have to consider intense events such as cyclone events that cause the roads to be cut off and potentially have a disruption to the food supply networks. That's one aspect of food security, but then there's also, I guess, other aspects of longer term impacts from climate change on the food supply system. And as Sophie mentioned, the traditional custodians have really expressed a lot of interest, concern about the impacts of climate change and want to be involved in identifying solutions for their communities. And another key aspect that has been raised and discussed a lot is the health impacts of climate change through more heat wave events. And I guess we're particularly concerned about those impacts on those communities that maybe are less prepared, in lower socioeconomic communities where they don't necessarily have as easy, or the cost of electricity and access to air-conditioned spaces is essentially more difficult for them. But if I'd ask you to just read through the actions there, and maybe you would like to sort of provide some comments back to us as part of this consultation. So yes, we've also identified industry actions. So I mentioned to you that as council, we're looking at our scope 3 emissions, which is really our supply chain. So we see that one of the biggest levers we can pull as council is to basically assist our suppliers to make the shift to providing lower emissions products and services. So we've started this journey of sustainable procurement, where we quantify the emissions associated with all the suppliers, the emissions associated with suppliers for those services. And we're going to work with those suppliers so we can educate them and assist, or be educated by them too. I mean, we need to understand this is we're all on this journey together. But we have a number of years before our target date of 2030 to be net zero. So we have time to prepare all of our suppliers to make this transition. So I guess the other thing that is recognised is that globally we're seeing a shift to a more low emissions economy. So it's likely that in the future, energy intensive industries will be penalised if they're also high emissions, if that's from high emission sources. So on the one hand, there may be penalties from if people aren't making this transition to a low emissions economy, but on the other hand, there's business opportunities for those businesses that are making this shift. So I guess that this ties into the idea of Cairns establishing itself as a smart green economy, where we look to transition industries away from. I guess the thing in Cairns, of course, is that we don't necessarily have. It's not like we're in other parts of Queensland where we have a coal industry that we're dependent upon, but we can look at ways that we can improve the way we deliver our existing industries. So we're talking with likes of TTNQ to understand how we can, and they're doing a lot of work I know in this space, to understand how those tour operators that are taking tourists to experience these wonderful World Heritage areas can do so in a way that is demonstrating that we are good custodians of these spaces as well. Sophie, did you want to talk any more about the smart green economy work that you've been involved with?
Just quickly, we are also commencing work on mapping out a roadmap for Cairns and Far North Queensland as a smart green economy. So we will be looking at identifying the key opportunities and a roadmap to further activating the smart green economy, including looking at the circular economy for council and the community as well. So we are sort of kicking off some more work in this space. So there'll be some workshops around this, and we'll be involving. There's quite a lot of momentum in the industry at the moment around this, and a lot of people quite interested. So that group is kind of moving this forward as well, not just council but industry stakeholders as well. So we'll be coming back to you in the future with a bit more information about that project as well.
Yes, and in the energy space, I think that the key opportunity is that as we're seeing the Northern Renewable Energy Zone be developed, there's going to be a lot of new renewable energy projects built in this region. I mean, at this point in time, this region actually, 75% of the electricity requirements in this region are already supplied by renewable energy. So as those new projects get built, we'll see this region become a net exporter of renewable energy to the rest of Queensland. So as council, we recognise that we can support this transition by directly purchasing electricity from these new developments. So in our case, we're looking to purchase electricity from a new wind farm that's soon to be under constructed. So hence we have the option to purchase 100% renewable, locally generated electricity. And of course, as I mentioned, we are looking at always improving energy efficiency through things. You know, there's a great opportunity there with all our buildings to continue to improve the efficiency of how they run and demonstrate best practice energy efficiency in the way we operate our facilities, but also we're talking with Ergon about LED upgrades of all the street lights and things like that. And then I guess we can do we know what we can do with our own operations. We also see there's an opportunity there for us to also work to advocate within the region, and also to provide education. All right, Sophie,
thanks. Yeah. So I'll just pick up on.
Okay, hand over to you. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Daniel. Another key area, as Daniel mentioned, is transport. So that was, I think, our second biggest pie on the community emissions chart there after energy. So there are a lot of opportunities. As Daniel said, not all of it is under council's control, but where we can help support that transition, we will help take actions in these areas. So around that transition to zero emissions transport, this is about like how we can help encourage the transition to electric vehicles, not only passenger vehicles, but fleet and also other transport and things like that, other modes of transport, active travel and public transport. So working with other industry stakeholders to help progress some of these actions as well around that transition to zero emissions. It's also about that transport network. So there's an action in there about developing an integrated sustainable transport strategy for the region in collaboration with partners such as TMR and others, and also considering mobility as a service. So so this is things like that sort of last mile connections, things like electric bikes, scooters, and how they fit into that transport piece, as well as, I mean, we'll be seeing that this area is rapidly changing. So we'll be seeing, you know, things like autonomous vehicles. As these things become more widely adopted, we'll be seeing how we can help the community to transition to these types of transport, and also planning for better networks. We're also kicking off a growth management strategy at the moment. So one of the studies that will feed into that plan for Cairns for 2050 is looking at transport and where those key centres are, so that we can actually get density around those and help, you know, create business centres and transport nodes to encourage people to use public transport going forward. The natural environment is a big one for our region. So in terms of the natural environment, there's two sort of parts of it. There's, you know, getting a resilient natural environment to make sure that we have that sustainable environment going forward, and also using those natural methods to capture carbon to reduce the emissions in the atmosphere. So under the resilient climate and thriving natural environment, our goal there is to be leaders in land biodiversity and catchment management, So we are actually looking at focusing a bit more on looking at sort of things like biodiversity corridors, catchment management, so looking at catchment-based approaches to our suburbs and how we can improve those natural ecosystem services. It's also looking at reducing the land-based impacts of our community on the reef and catchments and biodiversity. So, so looking at those waterways particularly and how we can lessen the impacts on the reef, and working with and learning from traditional custodians in this area. So you might be aware that a lot of the traditional custodians groups have land and sea ranger programs. So that traditional knowledge and expertise is really important to consider in coming up with different solutions to build resilience into our natural environment. In terms of capturing carbon in our natural environment, we'll be investigating some of the local carbon offsets as well, like opportunities around here, either on council land or in collaboration with partners. Daniel mentioned about offsetting, our emissions, 2030. So once we've done some of those things to improve efficiency and so forth, and we're looking at opportunities in local markets and how we can help support the green economy that we mentioned earlier by encouraging, the development of these carbon projects, because given that a lot of companies and governments have 2030 targets, there's going to be a big demand in this area for carbon offsets. So our region, in terms of the Climate Council, did a Clean Jobs plan recently, and that was one of the key opportunities identified for Far North Queensland was sort of looking at these ecosystems products as well. Another thing that we'll be looking at is regenerative agriculture as well. So how we can, capture soil carbon and improve our practices of things like composting and so forth. And the last sector we have is the built environment sector. So the built environment sector is quite a large contributor to community emissions. So in terms of the two parts that Daniel mentioned earlier, we are looking to help transition to low emissions infrastructure for council and also supporting the community to have low emissions buildings as well. So that's looking at our own facilities and also low emissions construction materials, but also supporting the community and industry through guidelines and events. So we do have some guidelines like the Tropical Urbanism Planning Policy and the Cool Homes Guide and things like that, but it's about building on those and also supporting events like Sustainable House Day, which we support annually, and other events to actually raise awareness. But it's also looking at how we can help advocate for improvements. I know the building industry is looking at going towards zero emissions as well, but there'll be support needed, for builders and homeowners to sort of say, what does this mean on a local basis? So we'll be providing, sort of staying in touch with all of that and providing information out to the community and helping support that industry as well. In terms of building a climate resilient built environment, we will be looking at incorporating climate risk resilience into planning and urban design. So making sure that we are aware of climate risks when we're developing our planning schemes, when we're designing our cities. Addressing coastal hazards. So Daniel mentioned that earlier. So we have also developed a coastal hazard adaptation strategy, which looks at coastal hazard impacts from now until 2100. And we have a long-term plan on how we'll manage those impacts over time. So you can have a look at that document as well on our website. Also providing guidance to build resilience in the built environment and addressing urban heat island effects. So we've already started some work in this space with an urban heat study, and we have about 80 sensors in our CBD. But what we're doing next is using that data and mapping our urban heat island effect and looking at how we can actually make improvements and reduce that urban heat island effect, and also providing, collaborative plans to work with other stakeholders on how we actually manage heat events and how we respond as a community. Working with nature to protect and restore our cities and suburbs. So this came out quite strongly in our engagement. People wanted to see, this rewilding the city using natural systems and bringing back nature into our cities and valuing the how those systems work in a city environment. So this will be things like, looking at our canopy cover, having some programs around urban greening and some targets there. Looking at nature-based solutions to addressing coastal hazards. So how can we strengthen our coastal areas through revegetation, strengthening dunes, mangroves and things like that. integrated catchment management plans. So this is when we actually will be looking at, that catchment approach I mentioned earlier, and, looking at all of those parts that make the catchment. How does that catchment manage flooding in the future, or like coastal hazards, like things like sea level rise? Where does that water go? How are we going to use the value of that catchment and make sure those catchments are resilient? But then also, how do those catchments link in with the community? So we've already started a little bit of work around this in Saltwater Creek catchment, but there's a lot of opportunities in this area as we have lots of waterways in through the city. Water sensitive urban design is obviously a big one. The other one is biodiversity corridors and enhancing connectivity of these. So understanding, to have resilience for our habitats and our ecosystems, it's like we need that connectivity, and we need to make sure that those are well connected and restore those where they're degraded as well. So we'll be working with our natural resources team on that one as well. And the final one is planning for sustainable growth. So I mentioned earlier that we were looking at a growth management strategy for Cairns, and that's looking at Cairns at 2050 with a population of 300,000 people. So this will require some careful planning, and there's a number of studies that will be feeding into this growth management plan, but we'll be looking at an all hazards approach to planning. So making sure that we consider all of those hazards. So things like bushfire, landslide, cyclone, flooding, coastal hazards and heat, etc., and mapping those and making sure that we are planning to, be resilient to those, and also not put people in high risk areas, or help people make those areas more resilient to the impacts of climate change. We'll also be planning energy efficient infrastructure for the community that minimises impacts to that natural environment. So when we are looking at investing in large infrastructure projects, making sure that, that is the consideration is there for, what emissions these will produce, and that's part of our decision making in our large infrastructure investment projects as well. So in terms of next steps, as I mentioned earlier, this engagement will be open on the 24th of November, when the council endorsed the draft strategy to go out, up until the 31st of January. There is a Your Say page on our website. So it's under our website under climate change. Just search for climate change. We'll be then changing, making any changes we need to in early 2022, and endorsing the plan around February, March next year, and then obviously implementing the plan following that.